my name is Rachel Schramm, and on behalf of the Iowa Cancer Consortium's membership, I would like to welcome you all to our final installment of the Iowa Cancer Consortium's Capacity Building Series for this year. And today we're focusing on cancer myths and clusters, which features two consortium members who are joining us from the University of Iowa and Iowa City. So we're very excited for that and have a lot of great information to share with you today. But before we get started, I just wanted to review some of the features of the Adobe Connect software that will be helpful for you. So on the top left-hand corner, which a lot of you have figured out, is that chat tool. So it just serves as like an instant messenger. So if you all can hear us, if you wouldn't mind putting in the organization that you represent in there, that would be lovely. But also throughout the presentation, you're more than welcome to type in any questions or comments that you have for the presenters, and we'll try to get that to them either in the breaks after the presentation or as we hold the questions for the end. So feel free to use that as you'd like. Below the chat, you'll see the attendees pod that shows all of our participants for today. And like I said, we have just about 30 participants registered, so I'm expecting this number to kind of hop up on here as people get their lunch. And below the attendees pod, you'll see a files pod, which contains some document that we'll be referencing today that you can actually click on and download to your computer. So if you need any help doing that, just feel free to message me, and we'll go ahead and get that ready for you. So just some other important notes before we get started. We've saved just about 15 or 20 minutes at the end of the webinar, especially for questions and answers. So kind of as we're going through, you can either type them into the chat tool and I'll kind of bank them for the end, or you can just keep them for the end and ask them then. But today's webinar will be recorded and it will be made available at our website, www.canceroiowa.org, sometime next week. So now, without further ado, I think I'm going to go ahead and just introduce both of our speakers for today, and then I'll let them go ahead and get started. So our first presenter for today is Dr. Mary Charlton, who's an epidemiologist and health services researcher at the University of Iowa College of Public Health and the State Health Registry of Iowa. Her research includes multiple studies of risk factors, healthcare utilization, practice pattern variation, and outcomes related to cancer using data from the cancer registries and other large databases. Her work has also included a number of studies focused on improving colorectal cancer screening rates among rural veterans. Dr. Charlton currently serves on the ICC's Board of Directors, and we're very happy to have her as one of our newer members. And our second presenter for today is an ICC veteran. Dr. Michelle West received her PhD from the University of Iowa in 1993 and has been working at the State Health Registry of Iowa ever since. In her current position, she oversees research that involves patient contact or medical record abstraction, as well as taking the occasional data requests and cancer cluster investigations. Some of you might be very familiar with some of her publications, as she works directly with Dr. Chuck Lynch at the registry on the annual Cancer in Iowa publication that comes out annually. And Dr. West has been a member of the consortium, like I said, since 2004 and continues to serve in a leadership capacity for the Data and Evaluation Committee, and we're very thankful to have her expertise. So without further ado, I think I'll go ahead and hand it over to Dr. Charlton. Are you ready to go?
All right, thank you. So before Michelle gets to the cancer cluster component of this webinar, we wanted to provide a broader context and a big picture of some of the major causes of cancer and some of the misperceptions out there regarding cancer. So we're going to start off with one of the easier questions here, which is, what is the #1 cause of cancer and cancer deaths worldwide? I think you can, hopefully you can see on your screen where you can select an option there.
So Dr. Charlton, we should have just about 15 people responding, so I'm kind of watching the numbers here too.
Okay.
So if you want to go ahead and cast your vote.
Okay.
All right, do you want me to cut it off maybe?
Sure.
We have 10.
Sure.
All right.
Okay.
So it looks like most of the folks said obesity, or I mean smoking, I'm sorry.
Smoking, right. So those of you who said smoking are correct. Smoking is the key cause of lung cancer, most of us know, and it's the leading cause of cancer in the oral cavity, esophagus, stomach, pancreas, cervix, kidney, bladder, and acute myelogenous leukemia. So, excuse me, I can move this here. And in fact, smoking causes 30% of all cancer. So one misperception is, or that you might have heard people say who are smokers. They might say, well, I've already smoked for over 10 years, so the damage is already done. I'm going to keep smoking. When in fact the benefit of quitting smoking in adulthood has been shown for all major cancers causally associated with smoking. Smokers who stop around age 50 avoid over half of all excess mortality from all causes, from lung cancers and from tobacco-related cancers. And smokers who stop earlier, around age 40 or less, avoid most tobacco-related cancer risk. So again, this emphasizes the importance of anti-smoking initiatives. And so while we're talking a little bit about lung cancer, I want to sneak in a slide about radon, because I think a lot of people forget about it or don't realize that it is actually the second leading cause of lung cancer. It's a naturally occurring gas that comes from rocks and dirt, and it can get trapped in houses and buildings. And in fact, nearly 1 in every 15 homes in the U.S. is thought to have high radon levels. The Environmental Protection Agency recommends testing homes for radon and using proven ways to lower high radon levels through radon mitigation systems. Okay, so now we're to a slightly trickier question. Hopefully we'll maybe get a little more variation in responses here. Which factors definitively cause cancer? Definitively being the key word. Go ahead and cast your vote.
So it looks like we got about 10 again, with the leader being all of the above.
Okay, I got a few more people there. Okay, we can go ahead and switch back. Actually, so I tricked a couple of you, a few of you there. It's actually certain infectious agents would be the answer, and I'll come back to why that is. But essentially, certain infectious agents cause a little less than 1 in 10 cases of cancer in developed nations, but it's more like around 1 in 4 cases in developing nations. Human papillomavirus, otherwise known as HPV, oops, sorry, those arrows moved a little bit in the slide, increased risk for cancers of the cervix, penis, vagina, anus, and oropharynx. Hepatitis B and C viruses can cause increased risk for liver cancer. Epstein-Barr virus can increase risk for Burkitt lymphoma, and Helicobacter pylori causes increased risk for gastric cancer. And always important to keep in mind that vaccines are approved for hepatitis B and HPV, which can significantly decrease risk of getting those types of associated cancers. So many of you might be thinking, hey, I'm pretty sure I've heard that obesity and some of these other things have been linked to cancer. And so that word definitive was kind of the key word in that question. According to this website on the bottom of the slide here, National Cancer Institute, they've sort of sorted these factors into ones that are known to increase risk of cancer and ones that may affect risk of cancer or are potentially associated with risk of cancer. So I think that's a lesser known distinction. And a lot of these, it's not to say that these factors on the right do not cause cancer. It's just that researchers often have trouble proving a causal link because of issues with accurately measuring exposure, or due to poorly understood mechanisms of action, or due to potential confounders that may not have been measured, because a lot of these things that we think may or likely do increase or affect cancer risk are often known through observational studies and not necessarily through clinical trials where it's easier to prove what causes what. And there's a whole list of criteria in order to meet sort of this criteria for understanding causality, and those factors on the right have not necessarily met all of those, according to the National Cancer Institute. So, but if you kind of take the evidence as a whole without that distinction and look at what factors, how can you attribute causes of cancer deaths in the United States? I thought this was a helpful chart that appears in that Iowa Cancer Facts and Figures, which looks like it's available for download here. Kind of quotes a study from a Harvard report on cancer prevention, and shows that 30% is attributed to tobacco, 30% to adult diet and obesity, sedentary lifestyle, and so forth. excuse me, so if you add together things like tobacco, adult diet and obesity, sedentary lifestyle, viruses for which there are vaccines, alcohol, the ultraviolet radiation part of the radiation one, some of those, if you add those together, you get to about 75% of cancers that can be modified by lifestyle or behavior changes or by something that is under our control. So, and diet is kind of an interesting factor in terms of, we hear a lot about it. We hear what types of different foods and nutrients and things like that can increase or decrease risk of cancer. Actually, the strongest evidence of a link between dietary factors and cancer exists for alcohol, which a lot of us have heard before, with head and neck, esophageal, liver, breast, and colorectal cancers. And this aflatoxin, which is a carcinogen produced by fungi in tropical areas. So I think we're probably not exposed to that one very much. But we do hear a lot about high intake of red meat, processed meat, barbecued meat, things like that associated with a higher risk of colorectal cancer. But there again, that absolute risk is quite small, and there's not an overall consensus about the magnitude and effect that red meat may have on risk of cancer. And same goes for fish, milk, dairy products, magnesium, other different kind of micronutrients, fruit and vegetables, some of which have been associated with decreased risk of cancer. But again, well, I'll get to this more on the next slide here. I liked this article and put up the link in case you want to hear more about this sort of discussion. But basically, researchers have found over the last few years, despite the promise of thinking, oh, there's a lot of these antioxidants and things like that can protect us from cancer, or certain things we need to stay away from to reduce our cancer risk, really much of that has not proven out in the literature and in the research. So again, the associations that have been found are not that strong. Often they're inconclusive and not reproducible between studies. And so this is kind of an interesting article that discusses that in the New York Times. But what we do know, with much stronger evidence, is that avoidance of weight gain decreases risk for cancer, especially colorectal, postmenopausal breast, endometrial, esophageal, kidney, and pancreatic cancers. So the strongest dietary recommendation for cancer prevention is to reduce caloric intake. And that's the bottom line, is everything in moderation and eat less, basically. Now, physical activity has also been linked to a decreased risk of some cancers, but it's not really known if that physical activity itself is the reason for this, if it's all sort of tied up in people's dietary habits and their weight and things like that. So it's really hard to disentangle some of these things when you talk about obesity, physical activity, sedentary lifestyle, things like that. But the clearest evidence and the biggest public health implication is reduce caloric intake and maintain a healthy body weight. So one more question for you now. Excuse me. Which type of exposure is linked to the largest proportion of cancer cases? Occupational, air, water, or soil? Go ahead and cast your vote. Okay, well, I think we can go back to the slide now. And I can show, aha, I stumped a few of you, that it's actually occupational, which is on the magnitude of somewhere between 1% to 5% of all cancers in high-income countries. And this is mainly due to asbestos, and then also silica, arsenic, polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, and some other environmental exposures. Global estimates for air, water, or soil pollutants are in the order of 1% to 2% or less of total cancers, which is in striking contrast with public perception, which often identifies pollution as a major cause of human cancer. Now, that's not to say that it's not a cause of human cancer or does not contribute to human cancer. There are selected areas, for example, residents near asbestos processing plants in the past, or drinking water that's heavily contaminated by arsenic. That environmental exposure may represent an important cancer hazard. but is quite rare. So if we basically know that we know the main things that we need to do to avoid potentially 75% plus of cancer and hold off cancer for as long as possible through things like not smoking, keeping our weight down, using sunscreen, checking our radon levels in our houses, using alcohol, and just about everything else in moderation. Why is it that we don't see these things more and in fact see other causes show up in the news a lot more? And I think the one explanation potentially for that are these things, the lifestyle changes are simply less interesting to talk about and are less newsworthy then, and so you don't see them as much coming up in the papers and things like that as things that, especially things that are kind of out of our control, which are what people, I think, find more interesting sometimes. So here's some examples that I found of some cancer myths out there. Cannabis oil curing cancer, and as a quote I put on the slide says, "Cancer is not one disease, but many different diseases with different causes. For that reason, one breakthrough cure for cancer is probably not likely going to come along." Another one I've seen quite a bit out there is the breast cancer linked to wearing bras. And they have a physician in the story that I found about this issue saying that although the idea of having one's breast in cages with metal wires, impeding fluid, and marinating breast tissue in toxic liquid sounds like a reasonable explanation for cancer, it is not. In fact, as she points out, far from being trapped, bodily fluid actually travels up and out of the armpits, not down toward the underwire. But a lot of these things, I read these stories, and there was things in there that seemed totally plausible when you read them, but often the understory is not provided in these types of excuse me, in these types of news stories that would help you understand whether or not this is actually plausible and what the risk might be. I think, did I skip a slide here? I'm sorry. So much of the information about cancer that is available on the internet is not completely accurate. And while there are many evidence-based, easy-to-understand web pages providing information about cancer, there are seemingly just as many that perpetuate myths. But NCI does provide a wealth of spreadsheets that help sort out fact from fiction, and I'll show some examples of those in a couple of slides here. So here, this National Cancer Institute website talks about cancer risk factors and possible causes, and so they have a lot of the main ones you hear about, and they give examples of studies that are out there and the strength of the evidence, and give a nice breakdown of those things. There's also one for cancer prevention. You hear a lot about different things that may or may not help prevent cancer. And then there is also one for common cancer myths and misconceptions. They talk about, the first one that comes up is cancer a death sentence, because there's a lot of people who still think, a diagnosis of cancer means imminent death, when actually 2/3 of people diagnosed with cancer are still alive at 5 years after their diagnosis. So there's a whole long page of these different types of myths and misconceptions that if you get questions in your work or have questions yourself, can kind of help separate out the truth from speculation. And one more myth I wanted to touch on is why everyone seems to have cancer, or also this kind of perception that cancer is going to overtake heart disease as being the #1 killer. And they had a really nice article in the New York Times that kind of breaks this down and explains things. And I liked this quote that I put to the side. As people age, their cells amass more potentially cancerous mutations. Given a long enough life, cancer will eventually kill you, unless you die first of something else. That would be true even in a world free from carcinogens and equipped with the most powerful medical technology. And in there, they talk about how heart disease and cancer are primarily diseases of aging. Fewer people succumbing to one means more people living long enough to die from the other. And I think I have included a graph here that they reference from the CDC. And if you can see, it doesn't look like this blue line, this #2, malignant neoplasms. It's hard to see. It actually is coming down slightly in more recent years. It's just not coming down as fast as diseases of the heart. So there's been a lot of progress in treating and preventing heart disease with statins and other things like that. And so it's not that one's overtaking the other, it's that they're both decreasing but at different at different rates. And really the great thing about avoiding smoking, having a better diet, exercise, avoiding obesity, those things are obviously big contributors to both heart disease and cancer. So avoiding those types of behaviors or living a healthy lifestyle will kind of help stave off both of those. But again, it's not like one is overtaking the other and growing at any rapid rate. Let's see here. So I think with that, I'm going to turn it over to Michelle, who's going to talk a little bit about cancer clusters and explain the process of going through those types of investigations.
Okay. Thank you. Here we're getting situated. Okay. I'd like to first start off with just a definition of clusters that are a greater than expected number of cases of a disease occurring in either a small area or within a short period of time. And in my work here with the registry, most of the calls that I receive are for those that are concerned about a small area, most often their own neighborhood. Clusters are commonly suspected for cancer. It goes along with what Mary was talking about, that people like to ignore their lifestyle issues and concentrate on broader issues. As you can see in that picture, she's actually worried about the effect on her unborn child from the sound of jackhammers and while she's smoking a cigarette. But they don't want to blame anything that they themselves are doing. They would rather blame it on something in the environment. Okay. We've basically been doing cancer cluster investigations since I've got here in 1994, and you can see we've done 130 of them through 2013. A couple of years we've actually done 15 of them, but oftentimes it's usually around a handful that we will do in a given year. What we normally do is once we conduct an investigation, we put another dot or square or triangle on this map so that we can show where we've done the actual cluster investigations and what the result was. So we will put up that round green circle if there were no excess found. So what that means is in a cancer site that occurs in both men and women, if there were no excess in either males or females, it will get the green circle. They will get the kind of purpley square if there's an excess found. And this would be if a site in both males and females were significantly increased in both males and females, or if a sex-specific site was elevated. And we actually had two cluster investigations that went on to have CDC notified. I can show you here with my, maybe. You can see up here in Butler County there was a multiple myeloma, and then down here in Washington County around the Wellman area was a brain cancer cluster. And we notified CDC. They actually did an investigation for the Wellman brain cancer cluster, but nothing else was done for the multiple myeloma. Okay, this slide I just wanted to show you. It's the most commonly used environmental exposure terms that we find in articles that are related to cancer clusters. And here in Iowa, we also hear many of the same things when people contact me that are interested in having an investigation done. Big ones being contaminated water, pesticides are the biggest two. The one that I'm going to talk about mentions natural gas, so it kind of goes along with the gasoline spill or the jet fuel that's mentioned there as well. Okay, but first off, I just wanted to give you an idea of how a cluster investigation is carried out here at the registry. We work very much hand in hand with the Iowa Department of Public Health. And normally what it starts is with a phone call or an email to myself or to Dr. Lynch. Normally it's just a concerned citizen who thinks that there is a higher amount of cancer in his particular neighborhood or one family member's area, and they would like us to look into it. They end up calling up and we talk about what their concern is, what the actual area that is of interest, and then we talk with them to come up with an appropriate comparison group, because we have to have the area of concern and then the comparison so that we can do the actual investigation. And then once we have that defined, I then get the data from Dan Olson here, who is my IT person. He will apply the roster of names and addresses that go hand in hand with the targeted area and the comparison group. And then I get the data, and then I can actually run a SAS program to provide the information that I need. We go through and we come up with a report that is prepared, and then I send that back out to the individual that contacted us initially, and then we also send a report to Dr. Patty Quinlisk at IDPH. That way, if somebody contacts her with a cluster concern in that, she's able to check her files and know if we've actually done an investigation in that area. Okay. Then if the findings support a cancer cluster, then the IDPH outlines the future plans. So it's up to them if they want to call CDC. If they work with them, they could then go out and collect more information from the cluster cases about residential and workplace history, family history of cancer, or any exposure to known carcinogens. They can review medical and scientific journals to gather additional information, and then they can go out and actually evaluate environmental contaminants such as water, air, soil pollutants. So that's what they did when we had the Wellman brain cancer cluster. They actually tied in with a research study that was ongoing and was able to get exposure information on a lot of things, but there were only 10 cases of brain cancer, and so it took about a 2-year investigation, and they were unable to really come up with a reason for the elevation in the brain cancer clusters there because the numbers were still pretty small. Okay. Most investigations do not confirm the existence of a cluster because primarily the number of cases is relatively small, but nevertheless, the investigation generally serves an important educational role. Dr. Lynch and I have found that most people are happy that we do. One investigation usually does it. We have had some people where if it's close to showing something, they will contact us in the next year and ask us to do another one to add in another year's worth of data. I've done that for a couple of people. I think 3 times is the highest that we've ever done. It usually suffices their curiosity and that sort of thing, and they're usually satisfied with the investigation. The one that I'm going to go through with you guys today is in Hudson, Iowa. It was one that was started in February when Dr. Lynch was contacted via email from a concerned citizen. He was interested in exposure from the Williams pipeline, which is near Hudson, and his interest was in bone marrow-related cancers. He thought that there had been an increase in that area over the last few years. He wanted as his comparison group a city of similar size with no fuel terminal. So I went through and found communities that were the same size as Hudson, and then let him go ahead and pick, and he ended up going with Kelowna, Iowa, is what we used for the comparison group. Just to show you where Hudson is, it's there by Waterloo. Okay, so then in talking with him, he thought that the seals on the tanks were at their worst in 2002, so that was his biggest concern. So then he backed up data to 1995, and then we went through 2012, which is our most current year of information that we have available here at the registry. We conducted what's called a proportional incidence ratio analysis, and what this does is it looks at the proportion of cancer from a specified cancer site relative to all the other sites of cancer in the target group, and then that is compared with the corresponding proportion in the comparison group. So it's not a real high-tech type analysis, but it's the best we can do because when we're looking at like neighborhood areas, we do not have population data for that in order to create like an incidence rate. So the proportional incidence ratio is the best that we can do. So what you want to look for is if your PIR is 1, then the proportions among the target group and the comparison group are the same. But if the PIR is greater than 1, then the proportion among the target group is greater than the corresponding proportion among the comparison group. And then we also, in this investigation and in the write-up, we will have the 95% confidence interval because you want to make sure that the PIR, that it's giving you a true magnitude of effect. So this confidence interval gives that magnitude with the 95% assurance. So that way you're not putting out a number there that really isn't very true. And that what you want to do, if you're looking for something that's significant, is to look for the confidence intervals that do not contain 1, and I'll show you that here in a little bit. Okay, so normally what happens is I get the data from Dan, I go through and I run the analysis, and then I create these tables. And we usually do for males and females separately as long as the numbers are large enough. Sometimes we will have to put males and females together. But for the Hudson one, again, this was Hudson versus Kelowna from 1995 through 2012. So this table is for males. And then what I do is I go through and I list all of the cancer sites that actually have at least 2 occurrences of cancer. This is the only time that we release data less than 5 due to confidentiality. So they have to have at least 2, and you go through and you list each site. You list the occurrence for Hudson as well as the occurrence for Kelowna, and then you get the PIR and then the 95% confidence interval that I had mentioned. So you can see that, you know, some of them are going to be like 1.29, here's 2.26. If they're lower than the PIR is less than 1, then you know that the proportion here in the target area is actually less than what you had in the comparison group. And then you see the confidence intervals. In this case, the first one goes from 0.49 to 3.39. So as I mentioned before, you look for ones that do not include 1. Well, this one is going to be contained in the interval. But when you go down here looking at colon, you can see that it starts at 1.38 and goes to 3.7. So that one is highlighted because it doesn't include 1. And then I just wanted to show you how the PIR is actually calculated. So for esophageal cancer, you can see that there were 4 cases in Hudson. So you take 4 and divide it by the total for all of the cases, which is 127. And then you divide that by the number in Kelowna, divided by the total number for Kelowna of 205. So if you take 4 divided by 127, divide that by 5 divided by 205, you get the resulting PIR here of 1.29. Okay, and then table 2 is done in a similar way. It's just for the females for all ages, 1995 through 2012. And again, you list each of the cancer sites that you're able to investigate. Sometimes, you know, you might have 5 of one type of cancer, maybe in Hudson, but then when you go to look in Kelowna, there might be 1 or there might be 0, and then that means that it will not be able to be investigated at that time since we just don't have enough data. And then what I do is I go through and I find the ones that are significant. In this case, it was lung and bronchus, bladder, and then malignant brain cancer. And then you can see that uterine here was highlighted, but it was actually less than 1, so it was not an issue here. Okay, so the results for the males, so that we saw an increase for Hudson in colon and lung cancer, and in females, we saw an increase in lung, bladder, and malignant brain cancer. And again, we saw that decreasing proportion of uterine cancer for Hudson. So then, as I mentioned before, what you try to do is you look, colon and lung cancer are obviously cancer sites that you would see in both males and females. So you would want to see that increase in both males and females. And we didn't see that for colon, but we did actually see it for lung. And then in females, we had an increase in bladder cancer and malignant brain cancer, but we didn't see the same results in males. And we were actually able to evaluate both of those. It's just that they were not significantly elevated. And then we saw the decrease in proportion for uterine cancer. We didn't see increases in non-Hodgkin lymphoma or leukemia, which is what his main concern was with the gasoline exposure. So then what we do is, so we had elevations of lung cancer in both males and females. And so the last part of the report that we do is we go into the risk factors that are known for the potential cancers that are elevated. So for this one, we would go through and write up about the smoking, the family history of lung cancer, being infected with HIV, radon, like Mary mentioned, and stuff. And so it's just part of the write-up. And unfortunately, we know nothing about the risk factors for this particular area because we haven't spoken to anybody, but at least we can give them what we know contributes to lung cancer, and then that way if a further investigation is done and stuff, they would know what the people would be concerned about initially. And then since we also had the, oh, that got kind of messed up too, the risk factors for uterine cancer, exposure to estrogen through estrogen-only hormone replacement therapy, or early menstruation, late menopause, never being pregnant, and then tamoxifen use longer than 2 years, and hereditary non-polyposis colon cancer, or a couple of syndromes, polycystic ovary or Cowden syndrome, as well as obesity. Okay, so then basically what we do is we have that report that's generated, and then we send that back to the individual, as well as I said to Dr. Quinlisk, and then if they want to do anything with it, we leave that up to them, or if anybody like newspapers or somebody contacts us in regards to a cancer cluster investigation, we have them actually contact the person who had the initial concern, and then if they want to release the information and stuff, they're able to do it that way. But okay, at this time, I think Mary and I are both willing to answer any of the questions that you have. Rachel will let you handle it, I guess.
Yep, that sounds good. I was going to say, I think a lot of our staff has a lot of questions because this is so interesting. So while we kind of wait for some folks to type in questions, one of the ones that we had was, how do you determine whether or not to notify the CDC? And I think that you had answered that it's kind of up to the discretion of the public health department. Is that right?
Yeah. Normally, it depends too. They can look at the PIR statistic itself to see if there are a lot of cancer cases that were in that particular site, and if the PIR is quite high, that it looks like it's a fairly strong increase and stuff. But yeah, we'll talk with Patty, and then she can make the final call.
Okay. And then one of the other questions that Kelly had here in our office was, can any citizen request a cluster investigation? Like, it doesn't have to come from a county health department or a mayor or anything.
Right. Actually, the majority of the cancer clusters that I do originate with a private citizen, and they can actually call my number directly, or we have our website where they can actually submit questions as well, so we get some that come through from our website. But yeah, anybody is able to contact us to have us look into a concern.
Awesome. And then, and you had mentioned that report goes directly back to the constituent that had asked the question.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
In addition to the Department of Public Health?
Yes, and then Chuck and I both have copies in our offices too, so that if we get a call and stuff, we can at least go to our files and see if we've actually conducted an investigation in that area in a prior year.
Okay. Well, again, if anybody has any questions, now's your time to go ahead and type them in. I know you guys do. But, Michelle, one of the questions that I had for you guys was, is there any mechanism within the state health registry where you guys would ever go, like, searching for clusters, or that you would be kind of notified of a higher rate or something like that, or kind of how does that work?
Well, normally we say that, our data here pretty much resembles what is being seen throughout the United States. And so we do keep up with what NCI and that are putting out in terms of if they see increasing risks in, say, NHL or that sort of thing. But we don't actually have a program or anything here that is ongoing to look for potential clusters. But we just kind of look through at our incidence rates, our mortality rates, and we have the mapping capabilities through the geography department and that sort of thing, so that if something is elevated and that we can delve into it. And, Dr. Lynch is involved with NCI and stuff, so that he's always looking into things that are brought up and that sort of thing.
Awesome. Well, we'll just wait here for another second and see if there's any questions. But
one thing I can mention, what makes it hard for the cancer clusters and trying to look for clusters, and that is that you don't have the population data at that small level. But people should be aware that we have our website out there where you can actually look at incidence and mortality rates at the county level. And so they can actually look at their own county. They can look at the counties that are next to them, and they can compare their own county rates to the state so that they can get a handle. And the way that I was talking about, if they generate the confidence intervals, they can then compare those to the state or to the adjoining counties, and they can see if their county looks similar or if their rates are lower or higher than those around them. And it's a nice way they can do that for any particular cancer site or for all cancer sites combined. And that our website it's very easy under Iowa Cancer Data, very user-friendly. But if somebody tries it and has questions, they can certainly contact me, and I can walk them through it.
Awesome. Well, it looks like the group is just in awe of your presentation and does not have any questions, except for I think the consortium staff are going to be following up with our billion questions. But thank you both for presenting so much today. I feel like we've all learned a lot of really new information that's going to be really useful to the work that we do out in the community, so we very much appreciate it. So I was going to say I am going to go ahead and just compile an email to send out to everybody to let them know like where the presentation is archived if you need any information. I'll probably include the presenter's information and then some of the links that we had talked about today. But before we go ahead and go, I do have one simple request, and that is that you go ahead and fill out a quick evaluation. It takes less than a minute, and it's very helpful to us and lets us keep doing sessions like this. So I'm going to go ahead and push that to you guys. If you wouldn't mind taking the time to fill that out, we would really appreciate it. So, all right. Well, thank you so much, Mary and Michelle. We really appreciate it, and we look forward to continuing the dialogue in the future.
Thank you for having us.
All right. Talk to you later.
Yep. Bye-bye.
Bye.